Good afternoon. My name is Douglas Knight. I'm co-director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture, together with Volney Gay sitting here to my left. I also want to acknowledge, before we go any further, the considerable contributions made by Erica Johnson, our associate director, and Barbara Kaiser, our assistant to the directors. There's a good deal of work involved in pulling together something like this from beginning to end, and we do appreciate all of your help. I want to draw attention to some of the materials about the center that we have by both exits. There are a number of items here that you can pick up and take with you if you'd like. There you'll see that we have currently about 8 research projects underway that involve some 80 faculty members from across the university. There are about 25 faculty members or scholars from elsewhere in the country or abroad, and I think over 50 graduate students also that we have helped to support in their own specific research projects. Our fundamental mission is to apply interdisciplinary approaches to the study of various ways in which religion and culture have intersected in the past and in the present. In addition to our research and discussions, we do organize and sponsor a number of lectures, conferences, and other events for the wider university community as well as for the public off campus. We're very pleased that all of you are able to come this afternoon. We do invite you to stop on your way out if you haven't done it already and fill out the sign-up sheet. There you can list your email address, which is a very extremely easy way for us to communicate to you about upcoming events that we have. I also want to call your attention, well, especially this item here. Don't need to go into more detail about the center. You'll see it summarized there. And the larger one, which lists the events that we have scheduled so far for the remainder of this semester. What we have left by your place is a white sheet of paper. The Templeton Foundation, which has supported this series, is very interested in knowing especially about the items that you see here on the bottom half of the page. And if you would please do that, we would fill out or just check off those items. If you want to add any details about the events so far this week, we appreciate your doing that. And if you don't receive materials from us, there's a place where you can leave your address as well as the email address. Thank you for doing that. You just leave that on your place and we'll collect it at the end. At the conclusion of the lecture, we will have a question and answer period, and following that, then a reception will be available directly outside this hall. We have the John Templeton Foundation and the Meta-Nexus Institute to thank for their generous support of these Templeton Research Lectures, which is now in its 3rd year. Previous lecturers were Rodney Stark and Christoph Koch, and we are delighted this year to welcome Dan Sperber from Paris. We've asked our own Tom Dillahay, who's professor of anthropology and chair of the anthropology department here at Vanderbilt, to introduce him.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the introduction. I want to take a few moments to speak to some broader issues related to the theme of today, ritual and religious institutions, to contextualize some of the details of the talks that have been given by Dr. Sperber and to link them a little more to the theme of today. I've participated in a lot of indigenous ceremonies and rituals, both small scale on the household level up to large scale indigenous ceremonies that often incorporate as many as 5,000 to 6,000 people. And I've also participated in religious events in our own culture and other cultures as well. And I think that the approach that's being taken by Dr. Sperber is very enlightening and very productive, and it's an overarching, gives us an overarching framework within which we can place some of the events and processes and thoughts that some of us individual scholars are experiencing and studying within our own context, but hopefully for all of you coming from different disciplinary backgrounds and experiences as well. So I want to speak somewhat to ritual behavior and just take a few moments before introducing Dr. Sperber. In indigenous public ceremonies, I'm talking about hundreds of people or thousands of people, some of the events I've participated in. I think what's important are our senses and neurological reactions. Ritual is full of all kinds of smells, sights, sounds, archaic languages as well. For instance, I work with some of the Mapuche and Quechua of South America, and the shamans and the ritual priests will select particular kinds of wood to burn, and there's burning fires everywhere. It's not the fire that's of interest, it's the smoke. Ash, cinnamon tree, and others. So the smell and the sights and the sounds of all of this affect the human body, the individual, and the collective corporate enterprise as well. And second, people generally are deprived of food and drink for many hours, up to 8 to 10 hours, where you're standing in public ritual and your behavior is being watched. You're full of anxiety, full of some fears occasionally as to your performance level. Exposed to the smoke, the chants of shamans, the sounds, the dancing, and everybody participates in different waves out in the middle of the ceremonial field, holding hands or holding shoulders and dancing and chanting. And you do this for 8 to 10 hours, and the physiological functions of the human body are humbled significantly. That introduces, at least in that particular context, an element of control by the ritual priests and the shamans. At that particular point, you're somewhat willing to listen to almost anything and somewhat ready to believe for the moment a lot of different things as well. And then there's archaic languages that are often used. But still, it's a familiar process. You've been through it a number of times. And each generation is brought into it. The young will see it differently. The adolescents, the subadults, the adults, the adult figures in charge of the ceremony. So there's a lot of different events, a lot of different processes taking place, and these cognitive causal chains and that Dr. Sperber is talking about is a nice methodological and explanatory way of fitting this information and these cultural flows and behavioral flows into a model that we can begin to understand the database and also begin to understand human behavior. And this is a degree of human behavior that's vastly different from shopping mall behavior. Our behavior, let's say, when people are at a sporting event, although that can be perceived as a ritual as well. Different sights and sounds and visual experiences and so on and so forth. But it's just not indigenous. I've had the opportunity to participate in the snake handlers, Pentecostal churches in eastern Kentucky. And it's interesting that the traditional churches are built on stilts, and for a particular reason. Because the chanting takes place, and there's a certain degree of stomping of the feet. And you do that because the snakes are on the floor, the cottonmouths and the rattlesnakes and the copperheads. And much like the flute player in Indian society, Southeast Asia, play the flute for the cobra, it gives it a mesmerizing effect. And it's not the sound, it's the vibration. Speaking of sound and vibrations. And so it impacts the snakes on the floor, but people are involved in that. There's a certain degree of performance levels. There's anxieties involved. And people are expected as citizens of the membership to participate in certain ways as well. But that's a different kind of religion. But the architecture of the church, the singing, the stomping, the movement of the snakes, occasionally some pastor or priest is bitten. And then you move into our modern day churches and go down, up and down where I come back from the house to the campus, and you see these monumental architectural features. The churches all along Hillsborough Road, for instance. I mean, when you walk into one of these places, there's a certain degree of silence, a certain degree of expectations. There's the opulence of the monument itself, all the ritual paraphernalia inside too. And this affects the senses in ways that are different from the snake handlers, different from the indigenous population. But it still has its neurological effects. And there are these events, and there are these processes, and these cognitive causal chains that's taking place. And it's very important, I think, to the whole psychology of an individual member being a citizen of the larger congregation. So you can go around the world and look at multiple societies and cultures, and past and present, and look at all the different values and belief systems, credence given to these belief systems, and multiple religions, and it becomes a highly complex system. And what's perhaps particularly important is that when you come to the large-scale public collective rituals, be it in modern-day society, such as some of the churches we see here in town and other places, or the indigenous population I was talking about, it's not just religion. You have to maintain those structures and organizations and those events and processes. And that calls for economic input, economic control, political leadership, both sacred and secular. There's scheduling of these events. One of the things I see that's very different from modern day society is that people go and participate in religion, whatever it may be, usually on the weekends, Friday, Sunday, Wednesday evenings. But in indigenous societies, it's congregated 2 to 3 times during the year for 5, 6, 7, 8 days. So the scale of participation is vastly different. And when you add the sensory overload for 8 to 6 days, you're exposed to some of these indigenous contexts I'm talking about, of fire and smoke and dance and so on and so forth. It has a different impact on people. And I think that this cognitive model is extremely important. Now, having said that, there's different ways to go about in the social sciences, and particularly in anthropology, to explain religious behavior on the collective level, the large-scale level that Dr. Sperber's been speaking to, for instance. There's a phenomenological approach, post-structuralist approach, cultural, human, political, ecological approaches, political economic approach, looking at the economy and political control of resources in a particular religious collective activity, and so forth. But I think, and I've read a number of Dr. Sperber's books, and I think that this cognitive framework and his event processual model of looking at causes and looking at the effects of those causes too, particularly as they relate to performance levels, is very important. And I think today in this final talk given to rituals and given to religion, I know he doesn't have the time to specify a number of anthropological and other case studies, but I hope that just a couple of 3 minutes I've taken here, I've introduced you to some of the non-indigenous, indigenous elements that some of us, not only in anthropology, but religious studies and other disciplines study as well. And I think that this paradigm of Dr. Sperber's is one overarching methodological explanatory framework that works nicely in putting a number of these variables in place and for trying to understand them at different levels of operation in multiple societies and cultures. Again, I think we should thank the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture for bringing Dr. Sperber to campus, and particularly Dr. Sperber for introducing us to your ideas during the week. And I turn over the microphone to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this introduction, and actually, which is highly relevant to what I want to talk about. Indeed, reminding us of some of the complexities and intricacies of complex religious behavior, also of the huge variety. As those who have followed the 2 first lectures know, I'm trying to look at things with a microscope. And I'm trying to do that because I think that, and that's the theme of the cause of religion, that causal powers are exerted at the micro level, and if we want to understand the macro phenomena, we do have to look at a very small scale causal processes. And of course, when you take a microscope, you lose much of this complexity because you're just looking at a small element, and it's good to remind us that this is what there is in the ground, and this is what ultimately has to be accounted for. So I'm particularly grateful for this introduction. So yes, today we'll talk about ritual and institutions, and when I'm saying I'm using a microscope, I will be, in fact, I was requested to give concrete examples, because I think you did, former lectures were a bit general. So I've experienced, if I talk in fairly general terms, then I get a request for more concrete examples. And as you will see when I get into concrete examples, people may regret the more theoretical level, but there's no way to, or at least I don't know the way to I mean, I haven't found yet the right balance between the two. If you invite me in 10 or 20 years' time, I may have improved a bit the show. If you remember, in the first lecture, I projected this as a fragment of the causal chain, cultural cognitive causal chain that distributes a folktale, for instance. It would be something similar for any kind of oral narrative, basically. And as I was pointing out, we could zoom in and out. We could zoom out, if you think of it as a fragment of a causal chain that distributes Little Red Riding Hood. One could zoom out to European history over countries and centuries, or we could, on the contrary, zoom in on one of the characters here, Blue, who's heard the story from Green and from Pink, and we can zoom in on what's happening in her mind and what we find in her mind. And as usual, when one changes computer, some letters, like in reformulation, are not on the line, but doesn't matter. So what's on her mind, just zooming in a bit, is that she synthesized the story from having heard various tellings of the story. She remembered it, she recalled it. At some point she's formulated in telling the story herself. She reformulates it and then therefore becomes a link in the transmission of the folktale. Now, what would it take to transform? So a tale like Little Red Riding Hood has spread, so to speak, of its own force. I mean, it's people tell it when they want to. If they don't want to tell it, they don't tell it. They may be asked by children or adults to tell it. There is no rule that says that a norm that says that you should tell it on special occasions. All it would take to transform Little Red Riding Hood, it might not be the best candidate, but in general to transform an oral narrative in an institutional tale is not much. In order to get an institutional tale, you have to bring in a rule about when and how somehow the tale has to be told. So, for instance, if you have a tale which is to be told, say, on Christmas Eve in some cultural group, then that becomes a mini institution. That's an institutionalized tale. So you have a rule, or a norm, which says when the tale should be told. So, but what does that mean? I mean, how does the rule have that kind of effect? I mean, rules are abstract things. How can they have causal powers? Well, they can't. There's no way the rule by itself will cause anything. So it's a good day today. I mean, a lot of people are calling because it's sunny. I've turned off mine just at the last moment. The rule itself, it's again our norm. These are abstract things which don't cause anything. What causes something is the representation in the rule in the actor. So you have the rule, and it plays a motivating role. It plays a role in getting the story to be told on Christmas Eve by the fact of being represented in the head of Blue. So because Blue knows that rule, and she gets further motivation to tell the tale on Christmas Eve, and that's what makes it an institutional tale. Well, not quite, because where does in what sense does she know the rule? How does the rule itself get distributed in the population? If it were not a shared rule, this would not be an institutional tale. So basically, the rule itself gets distributed just like the tale. So for instance, Green, who actually told the narrative, also transmitted the rule. Say, it was Christmas Eve, I'm not telling you this story because it's a story that's got to be told on Christmas Eve. And so that's how Blue learned it. And she in turn may transmit the rule. So the rule is transmitted. You have a causal chain that transmits the rule about when the tale should be told. And of course you have a causal chain that transmits the tale. So you have one causal chain that transmits the rule, that distributes the rule in the population, and another causal chain that distributes the tail itself in the population, and the two are causally linked. And this, I want to suggest, is what defines institutions. The combination of several cultural cognitive causal chains, such that some of these causal chains play a role in in keeping the other chains going. So let me propose a definition. An institution in this perspective is defined, is characterized by a complex pattern of distribution of cultural items, where some higher level representations, like rules, which says when you have to do what, are about the way lower level representations or practices or artifacts are to be distributed. And where the distribution of the higher level representations plays a causal role in the distribution of the lower level ones. So it's a complex pattern of circulation of information and objects and practices and artifacts, where higher level ones determine the distribution of lower level ones. So if you take the Templeton lecture, for instance, it's an institution. So there are some rules about have a committee choosing a lecturer, inviting him or her to give the lectures, announcing the lecture publicly. And this plays a causal role in somebody finding, this time himself, in this room, in front of an audience who also has been informed of the event. And that makes it an institution. But in fact, even that is more complex, because the Templeton is more complex than my Christmas tale. And there are rules about the way foundation works, and they themselves, to which institution they will give the possibility of setting up such lectures, and so on and so on. And if you think of a university, it involves also many complex levels. It's all about distribution, in this case of knowledge representations and so on, more than artifacts. And there's a complex piling of rules which are about who says what to whom when, and who appoints who says what to whom when, and so on, and in many high levels. And these rules determine not just the transmission of knowledge, but also the building of buildings, the appointment of rooms for various lectures of artifacts like this computer and so on. But this is true also for economic institution or military institution. What gets distributed at the lower level, in this case, may be goods, food, or weapons, or killings of violent practices of various kinds. But it's still what makes these social phenomena and institutions are indeed this complex pattern I'm alluding to here. And I'm just looking at the simplest kinds of examples today. So rituals, again, to summarize what I've said about institutional tales, you have the distribution of a rule playing a causal role in the distribution of a tale, and it's the combination of the two that's the institution. Now, I want to talk about a concrete example of a very simple ritual. And let me give you just a minimal amount of background for that. I did, as I think I've already mentioned, my fieldwork among a group of agriculturalists and weavers in the south of Ethiopia called the Dorze. And the focus of my work, I worked on what to anthropologists would be part of the anthropology of religion. I worked on a very complex system of taboos that they have, ritual rules that they call gome. Gome are rules about things that you should not do or should not do, and breaking these rules has a number of bad consequences. It's met with mystical sanctions. You may become sick, your cattle may be sick, your children may be sick, other misfortune may happen. And in order to prevent this or to try to correct this misfortune, to offset them, you have to engage into various ritual behavior, like in particular offering or sacrifice. Examples, so there are hundreds of such rules. I mean, I've collected nearly 1,000 of such rules, and they will go through from major taboos, major gome like incest, to relatively minor one like killing a bird, or drinking honey, liquid honey, that's kept for offerings, and so on and so on. And it's not, you might think, and when I say it's a society that's dominated by these taboos, you might think that people live in fear and awe of breaking these so many rules that are around them, but that's not what happens. We're not particularly, they're fairly good-mooded people and not particularly anxious about breaking or not breaking rules. That's not what happens. Well, the rules play a role, not so much in guiding behavior. They do, of course, do so, but much more because they are invoked ex post facto in explaining misfortune. So when misfortune occurs, and it occurs quite naturally as it does everywhere in the world, then the standard question that the Dorsey will ask is, what gome was broken, was violated? Other society may ask, who is the witch? So you have, explanation. If you take explanation of misfortune in mystical terms, in terms of mystical or supernatural forces, it may come from enemies, from others, who are attacking you by mystical means, as in witchcraft, or it may come from your own failings, and you get a kind of punishment for you having broken and brought upon yourself or upon your family this misfortune. When the misfortune occurs, a typical pattern of event, a succession event is like this. You go and consult a seer. And there are various techniques of divination. I won't go into that. And the seer may do two things. She may, they're often women, she may suggest just a simple offering, like an offering of honey, or she may think it's more important and suggest a sacrifice. If a sacrifice, whereas anybody can go and see a seer, a woman, a junior member of a society, only senior members of household, heads of household, can perform sacrifice. And when a sacrifice is performed, you go to see a special kind of diviner, enteromancer, that is somebody who reads the entrails of the animal, of typically the sheep, who's been sacrificed. And if things go well, if the sacrifice has been effective in doing away with the cause of the misfortune, then a final offering will end the process. There are lots of other possibilities and paths, but that's a typical set of possibilities. Well, the seer can either recommend a sacrifice or a mere offering. Now, let me give you a concrete example. So this takes place in the household of Albazo. Albazo, who is here in green, is the son of his father just recently died. His mother, Bode, still lives in the house and hasn't quite accepted yet that now her son is the head of the household and she's not the main woman there. The main woman now is Mate, the wife of Albazo. They had a child, but that child died, so she doesn't yet have a full adult status, even though they've become the senior members of the household. The absence of children, the fact that the father died only recently, makes it so that they're not quite in the role at this point. I followed the ritual activities in 40 households for about a year, and so I'm just picking one example out of the ritual activity in the house of Albazo. I'm taking a very, microscope, a very simple example with a very simple resolution, a ritual, as you will see. But I'm doing that in order to make some more general and theoretical points, which I hope it will succeed in illustrating. So what happened is that in October 1970, so you can tell my fieldwork was a long time ago, Albazo's wife, Mate, her eyes had been hurting for a while, for several days, so she decided to go and consult a seer, a woman from the neighborhood who was doing divination using pebbles. And the seer said, well, there's a gome of honey. And Mate remembered having eaten some of the, or drunk actually, some of the honey of her husband kept for offerings. So instructed by the diviner, by the seer, she confessed her fault to her husband, who made an offering of honey. And I want to go through this small causal chain in greater detail, put it under the microscope. So there we have inside, as usual. Remember, I'm using round boxes for mental states and events, square box for public states and events, different colors for different people. So Mate is in blue, and there she's thinking my eyes are hurting, and she is hesitating between various course of action. She could go and see a seer, she could wait and see if it gets better on its own, or she could go to see a healer, another possibility that I haven't mentioned. If she waits, no, that's just an individual decision. If she decides to go and see a seer, she's putting her own behavior in a long, extended cognitive, cultural cognitive causal chain. She's adopting a culturally provided behavior pattern and adding her own behavior to this chain, extending this chain through her own behavior. Same thing as she's go to a healer. So the decision she makes will reinforce one of the two practices. As indeed there is this possibility when you, instead of misfortune, I hadn't mentioned before, you can go the mystical route of consulting a seer, or you may go to a more practical route of consulting a healer who are not supposed to have particularly supernatural capacities. So she decides to go to see a seer, extending. So I'm using in these big arrows illustrate the cultural causal chain as they go through the actions and mental states of these particular individuals, of Mate in this case. So she goes to see the seer, and she says to the seer, my eyes are hurting, and the seer, who is in yellow, asks herself, as the automatic question in this cultural context, what gome has been broken? And of course she does a technique of using pebbles and so on, but it's a fairly, that leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and basically she has many different possible diagnostics that she could provide. She could say it's a gome of this, a gome of that, a gome. She might even say it's not a gome, it's witchcraft. It's a rare type of diagnostic in this society, but she could do that. And so, again, putting her own behavior in a cultural causal chain and contributing to extending this particular causal chain. So those gomes which are never invoked by diviners become obsolete and vanish from the scene. And those which are often invoked become central elements of the culture. In fact, they may become so important that you'll have sub-kinds of gomes that will end up being distinguished, and they can become elaborated and enriched if they are frequently invoked. So she's decided it's a gome of honey. And look at what she's doing there. I mean, it's a gome of honey is not just a very specific diagnosis. There are various ways in which you could break a taboo, violate a rule regarding honey. So one way is by eating it, the honey that's of a sacrificer, of a head of household. If you put dirt in it, or if you give it to lick to a dog, this would also be a breach of taboo. Or if you spilled honey without any reason, that would also be gome. So a number. So she's pointing the diviner in a certain direction, but it is Mate who now says, "Oh, I remember. Yes." What does she remember? I hate my husband's honey at some point. And so now they both in their interaction, they're defining. There's a kind of negotiation, if you want, by which they define what kind of taboo was broken. The taboo is defined both by, first, generally categorized by the diviner, and specified by the person who is consulting, by Mate. And then now the diviner is in the position, having had the diagnosis confirmed, Mate could have also have said, no, honey, I don't remember anything, and gone to another diviner. So it's also important for diviner to provide diagnostics that are accepted by the people who come and consult them. Those who produce diagnoses that are not popular, so to speak, not fashionable, will lose customers, and they will lose their impact on the whole cultural system. But now the diagnosis of gome of honey has been accepted, and the diviner must give some prescription. What rule should be followed? And there are two, again, I'm simplifying things. The diviner could say, that's really important, it's very bad, your husband has to perform a sacrifice, or take it more lightly and say, well, it's enough, so you go the sacrifice route, or say it's enough to do an offering, typically an offering of honey. This is what the diviner actually decides. And again, I mean, if you ask for a sacrifice, the risk that this would be seen as too costly, and somehow it would be forgotten, they would go to another seer, she would keep suffering for another week with her eyes, what makes a certain cultural practice successful has to do with the way it's being taken, interpreted, accepted, refused with greater enthusiasm or reticence by all the people involved. So the seer say, ask your husband to forgive you and to make an offering of honey. And so, you know, she accepts the advice. Indeed, she might refuse it. She might say, no, I don't want to tell my husband or whatever. But she does accept it. She tells her husband, I ate your honey, forgive me. And so he's there with, again, he's making a choice. He could say, you know, rubbish, who did you go and see? This here is no good, and so on and so on. Or she, what, she ate my honey, gourmet of honey? Well, I'll forgive her, yes. And he makes an offering. And so this little practice of making an offering of honey, that's what it is. I mean, it's liquid honey in a gourd. You take some and you spit it at the right place. So it's a ritual. It's a very, you know, I said a microscope. To put things under a microscope in a 1-hour lecture, you take a very small ritual, not the rituals or rituals you are evoking, but nevertheless a ritual. It's and an institution, so a certain kind of practice that occurs because there's a distribution of rules about when and how it should actually take place. So this little event, which on the one hand is just a social cognitive causal chain among free people, at the same time is something that reinforces a particular cultural causal chain at the expenses of, so to speak, competitors, all the choices that could have been made at each juncture along the causal chain. So again, I go back to my definition of institution and suggest that it works in this case too. An institution is characterized by a complex pattern of distribution of cultural items where some high-level representations, here the rules of gourmet, the system of gourmet, the rules that are uttered by the seer who says what should be done, they are about lower-level representation, about interpreting what the consultant is saying, and about practices, what should be done, about artifacts, the offering honey, and so on. And so what you get there is, on the one hand, we have the diviner's expertise that's being distributed in the society in a certain manner, for interaction among diviners themselves, diviners and their customers and other specialists I have no time to talk about. And this plays a causal role in maintaining, perpetuating, transforming the distribution of these micro-events, which are consultation of diviners, offering, sacrifices, all these events that take place. And again, depending on what preferences the diviner express for one diagnostic rather than another, one prescription rather than another, depending on the reaction of the consultants and their willingness to accept the advice and so on, you will find that the distribution of various practices of, say, offerings versus sacrifice, certain type of offerings rather than other types of offerings and so on, a certain type of diagnostic rather than others, will vary in time, bringing about a cultural change made of just a change in the distribution of different types of practices and representations. And of course, there's some feedback from the practice and of the consultants, of the lay people in their interaction with the specialists, with the experts, because they choose which expert to consult, they choose how they interpret what the experts say, and how to act on that basis. So the example I gave was an example which went directly to an offering. And when you consult a seer, which, as I said, anybody can do, a woman can do, and seers. No, but we have a replacement. It's all magic. Yes. So the type of diagnosis you get from seer is different from the one you get from people who read the entrails, or these other diviners. Why? Because the entertainments can be consulted only by men, which are heads of, I think I have a picture of what happens, yes. So that's the sacrifice also, is about to make a sacrifice. And then you get the entrails, and here are two diviners discussing their interpretation. And if you look at entrails, that's what you see, the entrails of a sheep. Now, what you read in the entrails of a sheep, and you can't see that properly, I mean, there are patterns of blood vessels, and they're just like a genealogy, a bit like the fragment I was showing you of the family tree of Albazo, like a family tree. And you look at which blood vessels may have little glands or blemishes on them to find out which ancestors might be displeased, which kind of taboo has been broken, and so on. So the type of diagnosis that typically come out of divination through the entrails have to do with social order and with the privileges of the elders. It's male-oriented, hierarchy-oriented, type of diagnosis that tend to prevail. I mean, you can diagnose everything on the entrails, but these will tend to prevail if you go to a diviner who reads the entrails. Whereas seers will invoke typically much greater variety of taboos having to do with more individual rather than social structural features. So it makes a difference whether you go one way or another. So men, in fact, and especially elders, not only will prefer to have some sacrifice takes place which reinforce the power, but they can even bypass the consultation of a seer and just go, if they're rich enough, go directly sacrifice when there's some misfortune. And the enteromancer can call for more sacrifice and so on. So there's some an invisible tension between two roots which yield two types of interpretation of misfortune. One which is more male-centered, if you want, more power-centered. The other which is gives a greater role to women and to individual stories. Of course, this tension is never directly expressed in those terms, but if you look at the micro-choices that people make, this is what you will actually discover. And the cumulative effect of these micro-choices bring about changes or some form of stability in social relationship and religious behavior. By the way, one of the points I made in I think it was the first lecture, of course, when we're talking about sacrifice to ancestors and so on, this is religious behavior, at least by any anthropological standard. When we're talking about consulting a seer or just saying an offering of honey, is that religious, isn't it? Well, typically the question doesn't arise. All this is part of the same system, and there is no problem of classification, deciding whether it's religious or not. It's just an illustration of the fact that the notion of something being religious is a very general notion with a lot of limiting case, for which there is no strong theoretical reason to try to decide where they fall. So just to show that the accumulation of this micro decision is also relevant to the explanation of macro changes. In 1974, the emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, was deposed by a revolution, which rapidly claimed to be a communist, Marxist, and so on, and it had a number of effects on the ritual practices that you found among the Doze. So from then on, elders were considered bourgeois, which, I mean, if you think, they're poor people, all of them, and if you think of Albazo, head of a household of 3 people, as a bourgeois, but nevertheless, that's how we were considered, and sacrifice was considered a superstition. So the effect of that, again, is in terms of micro-decisions. When somebody had to choose between making a sacrifice, going to enteromancer, or going to a seer, suddenly the cost of making a sacrifice was becoming more important. So that this created pressure in favor of going to see seers. So seers gained in importance, and the personal gomes became more important than the social structural gomes. And moreover, one of the effects of the Marxist revolution among the Doze is that witchcraft became more important than responsibility, so to speak. The attribution to others as a source of misfortune rather than to your own action is a type of diagnosis that fits better if you strictly have a seer and if the people who read the entrails are brought out of the picture. What happens is, I mean, all the gamut, all the array of possible ritual actions and diagnosis was still available, but the frequencies were changing dramatically in favor of personal gomes and even witchcraft. So we're done with this example. I'm sure it was too concrete for many of you, but I hope it illustrates the point I want to make. And I will come rapidly to a conclusion because I felt in the other, first I think I've talked some time, and also it's good if we have a bit more time for questions and discussion, I feel, for this last lecture. So what I want to suggest here is that if you look at religious practices, and the same argument would apply to behavior, which are also transmitted through practices, of course. They depend on communication typically in ritual context. So religious practices are the way they are, and they change the way they change as a result of the cumulative effect of micro-events along these cultural causal chains. That's where the causing is happening. That's where it's happening. So if you look, of course, if you zoom out and you look at the historical scale, you may think that you're seeing major event, and you are maybe seeing major event of religious change, but the way they take place, unless you have dramatic things like massacres and killing people of a certain denomination and so on, which of course are quite important too, to transformation, but then you're not dealing with a kind of evolution of a religious system. The change that take place through these micro events. And so to study them, one must look at the causal factors that affect the probability of different types of events occurring along this causal chain. And by type of event, I mean one diagnostic rather than another in divination, preferring one divine than another, trusting one type of diagnostic more than another, performing a sacrifice in a specific manner rather than another, and so on. And in this perspective, institutions, which are so crucial to religious systems, they're not an external factor. That is, they're not part of a context in which these cognitive causal chain extend themselves in social and historical time. They're part of these cultural cognitive causal chains. They're just special patterns of these causal chains, where, as I suggested, some causal chains play a role in the success of others and kind of guide, provide rules for the way others should be distributed. So I'll come to a conclusion now. So religions are, from an anthropological point of view, of course, cultural systems. I think you were talking about the overlap between culture and religion, and when you were saying that, I said, well, the overlap, it's just, from an anthropological point of view, it's inclusion. There's nothing about religion that's not cultural. And cultural systems are vast arrays of mental and public events that are causally linked in a way that tends to preserve the form and content. So you need the causal links, you need the causal chains, and what's important that they should be cognitive in the sense I characterized in the first lecture. That is, they realize relationship of information, particularly the preservation of information, preservation of content, of meaning. It's not enough that you should have causal link. The causal link should be at the same time links in meaning, links in content or in form. So changes in cultural systems are change in the relative frequency, in the distribution of mental and public events of different types, of different content, of different form. That's what's changing. If you zoom out, it may look like changes of a macro nature, but what is actually happening at the micro level. And so the causal forces that stabilize and transform these cultural systems, in particular religious systems, are active at every juncture. And I mean by every juncture, I mean every micro event inside the mind, in the interactions among specific individuals along the causal chains. So if you have to take just one take-home message, and if you're interested in the cause of religion, causes and origins are two different things. I mean, you may be interested in the origins of religion. I don't think, myself, I don't think it's a very good question. But in any case, cause and origins are not the same thing. So if you can point to the origin of some religion, particular religion, in time, in historical time, say things which happened in Palestine 2,000 years ago, as very much the origin of many religions of today, these play the causal role through a series, a succession of causal events that happen every time, every day, during these 2,000 years. I mean, you don't have the cause from what happened then to what you find now in any kind of direct manner. Every day, at every moment in time, religion is being caused in the present in millions of mental and public events. That's where it's happening. So that's my take-home message for this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're open for almost a half hour's worth of discussion if you'd like. Start back.
I'm wondering how you understand the role of emotion in causation and subsequently the role of emotion in causal chains.
It's a very good question. Emotions are absolutely central. If you look at the history of a cognitive science, clearly there was a neglect of emotion in the 60s, 70s, and so on, at the beginning of the cognitive revolution. Basically, we didn't know how to approach them. I don't think that anybody thought, or if some people did, they were a minority, that emotions were not relevant, that they were outside of the picture. But what happened is there was, because of understanding information processing, a way to understand the more intellectual aspect of cognition in a novel and important manner. Now, some of the important developments that have taken place also by the getting closer of the cognitive, the intellectually more formalist information processing approach on the one hand, and the development of psychology and neurobiology, is that we understand emotion better and better, and the picture of cognition we have now strongly, I mean, fully integrates, not as much integrates, or as it's aimed to integrate the emotion. So they're quite crucial, as you were pointing out. Of course, in a religious context, they play a crucial role in guiding micro-interpretation, micro-choices, preferences, the way things are being lived, the reason why people maintain certain practices, or on the contrary, move away from them. So yes, I certainly, when I defend a cognitive approach, I certainly do not mean or intend to put emotions to the side. They're quite central. Should I? Okay, please.
If I understood you correctly, the first lecture, you said the right question to ask was not, what is religion? However, I keep wanting you to give at least an operational definition of how you're using the term.
I'm using it, if you're an anthropologist, you find across the thousands of societies about which we have some knowledge in the world, a number of practices which are fairly systematic, linked to beliefs, to various forms of communication, which have many commonalities, which typically involve supernatural powers, ritual in the sense of this form of behaviors that are supposed to have some efficacy but use non-standard forms of causality and so on. So you get this kind of complexes. As I pointed out, inside, if you look locally, within a given complex of that kind, you may find things that you might not want to call religious and others that you do want to call religious. But from an anthropological point of view, this should not be an issue. So we start with these kind of phenomena. They're also challenging precisely because beliefs in the supernatural, belief in forms of causality, non-standard form of supernatural causality, as you get in ritual, raise issues of understanding, first of comprehension of what caused people to think and act in this manner, and also issues of rationality. I mean, what kind of cognitive system, efficient cognitive system will yield such beliefs and practices. And as I pointed out, even if you yourself say are a believer in a given religion and are convinced of the truth of a number of religious tenets and of the efficacy of a number of religious practices, this will do for your religion, but it won't do for thousands of other religions where you think they will raise for you too a problem of soundness and efficacy. So we get this range of issues that we approach under the general label of anthropology of religion. I've seen no reason to assume that there is anything more specific to be sought in a characterization or in a working definition or whatever of religion.
Your concluding comment was that we live in the present, we act in the present. That strikes me as being something we can all readily accept, because we don't act in the past, we don't act in the future. It may be that certain rituals from the past, certain customary actions are still operative in the present. So, what I'm interested in trying to get at more precisely is whether there is a universalizing thrust to the CCCs.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I have in mind. I'm a literary critic, historian. I interpret all the time. And I'm wondering, with regards to your topic, which is rituals and institutions, what happens when the ritual of interpretation, the performance of an interpretation, shifts, not necessarily in the meso, it's all within the meso level, but not necessarily in terms of scale. If you read a Jane Austen novel, they are all constructed according to a certain expectation, and there's a ritualized performance, which is quite satisfying for many readers. If I think back upon my own upbringing in the Roman Catholic faith, well, there's a ritual which is associated with confession on Saturday evening, and there's a kind of atonement which is achievable, and that would be religious versus literary cultural, but they're both cultural. The third example would be asking a question after an academic performance, such as this. There's a certain expectation of how one asks questions, how one responds. My question, therefore, has to do with the CCCs involved here, and whether there is an alteration in substance moving from the literary, which is an institution, to the religious performance as an institution, to the academic in the pursuit of knowledge, which is an institution and also a ritual. Do we lose or gain anything? Do we learn anything more about what the specific need is that religious belief fulfills, as opposed to a secularized belief in the illuminating light of reason?
Let me start, rich and important question. Let me start with the end. You ask what religious need, what needs that religious belief or activity fulfill. I hesitate between putting on the causes no need, I mean no function. What makes you think that it fulfills a need? That it fulfills a need that exists independently, that is not created by religion itself. I mean, smoking fulfills a need, but the need comes from smoking. Music, to take something more positive than smoking, fulfills a need, but you don't have a need for music before you have music itself. So music and smoking are addictive. One is nice, the other is not nice. But they create themselves a need that they fulfill. I think this is true of many cultural things. And again, this is no value judgment implied. I see no reason to think that this is not the case for religion too. So at least I don't see why we should take for granted, as is so often the case, that there has to be some kind of need that pre-exists religion, and that religion comes and fulfill. Yes, please.
In your example
Mm.
of relating to sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
you always start with this need, misfortune.
Misfortune is not exactly a need. Misfortune is a problem that has to be addressed. But it's not exactly, it's not the same thing as a need for religion. When people speak of a need of a religion, it's a need for some kind of explanation of making sense of and so on, which religion would be uniquely well suited to fulfill. So of course people have lots of needs, but the issue is there a need that is specifically tailored, so to speak, that it needs religion to be fulfilled. But that was just a reaction to the end of
Yeah,
yeah.
I also want to tie into what you said to your second part, and that is the event gives rise to an interpretation, to an effort to understand what the event was.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And that leads to, as we know, in Nietzschean terms, we really can't get to the thing in itself. We really don't know the event. All we know is how we react to it. And then that is
But that's the question of the origin. How did it start? Doesn't matter. What's really important, so to go back to the first point with which you start, kind of suggesting that I was making a trivial point when I said causation is in the present. I don't think it's that trivial. I mean, if you look at a monument, here you have a version of a Parthenon. If you look at this one or at the copy they have in Greece, which is in a poor state, and they didn't have the technology to make it in concrete. But if you look at these things, you want to explain it, you can largely, stop the story at the moment it was built. Or if it's in ruin, like the Greek version, you have to explain what happened, how it got destroyed. And of course, it's the fact that it went on existing involved daily causes. But they're not really relevant to understanding the structure of a thing. The structure was fixed by an act of creation, by the building initially. And then it was maintained in a fairly relatively trivial manner by general physical laws. Whereas what I'm saying about religion, it's active all the time, and it's if it happens to maintain today something that started 2,000 years ago, the chances it maintains with lots of transformations. So much is maintained, much is also altered in the process. But that has to be thanks to a causal process that reactivates the content, the specifics, as you go along. So the explanation of why you have this belief now can't be because of some event that happened then. It may, if you have a whole causal chain, it will bring you back there, but you need causal forces acting all the time. So that's the difference, yes.
This might be to John's point, which is, as many of you know, about 100 years ago, Freud said that adult neuroses were caused by childhood traumatic, sexual, young age.
Yep.
And it's a narrative, very
Yeah,
powerful
yeah,
narrative.
yeah.
It lasted 100 years. But on your lines, that can't be true. And I would argue it's not true. If you actually look at currently traumatized adults who may have had a sexual encounter, the problem is that encounter was remembered every day afterwards, and every part of his or her life has been reinterpreted daily
Yeah.
based on that experience. So that it isn't 38 years ago something happened. It's the way the patient construes her life or his life today. So there's actually, I think,
It's
something similar.
Yes, indeed, it's something similar. So you could contrast that with, say, somebody who lost a finger, had a finger cut 37 years ago. Of course, biology was active every day for what remains to remain, but the cause was then, basically. That which explains the structure of a hand now was then. It didn't need this, the reactivation, the physical maintenance doesn't add to the explanation except in a trivial way. Whereas what you're suggesting in the case of an initial trauma is that it's being reinterpreted, giving meaning every day, being active every day with its content that makes it potent now. And indeed, I'm suggesting something similar in the social case. I didn't answer all of your questions. Maybe I'll try just one more, but so maybe, well, we'll have doing the drinks. Yes, please.
In your example,
Yeah.
could you comment on the fact of the outcome? Did the right lady's eyes improve, did they not? And how important it is for the outcome to reinforcing the credibility, the seer, the strength of the
Yeah.
possibility of the first chain of events, as opposed to the strength of the institution itself and the authority of the institution?
It's a very good question. I don't have actually, I checked in my record, I don't know what happened to it. Probably what happened is what happened normally. In most such conditions get better anyhow on their own. So if you've done done something to cure things, you'll be somehow confirmed. You have reason to think that your action has been beneficial. So what you find is that the chances are of such practices hooking onto uncurable conditions onto damage about which nothing can be done are very slight. You don't, that's not your run-of-the-mill daily type of practices aimed at acting on misfortune will typically be triggered by those kind of misfortune which have a good chance of getting better. So the ecological probability, the natural probability of various kind of conditions getting better on their own will select different types of beliefs and practices to deal with them. So you also have practices to deal with death and with other misfortunes about which nothing can be done, but they don't act in the same manner, and they don't necessarily have the same type of goals. So when there's failure, that's no problem because the sacrifice may not have been done well. There may have been another taboo. So that's always easy to. So first, there is no. The kind of evidence you will get with this kind of condition, like your eyes hurting and so on, and short-term practices aimed at curing them, will be quite positive. They will tend to show that yes, the practice works. And for the exception, you have a range of explanation going from not a very good diviner, not a very good piece of advice, the sacrifice wasn't done properly, all this was okay, but there was a further cause, and so on. So there's always compensatory possibilities. But if you had to rely on them every time, I think the practice will not stabilize.
So this vision itself is not very frequent.
No, because as long as they remain within a fairly low frequency, no. And if they were in another kind of frequency, then they would have to, the content of the belief and the practice would change. You would get micro decisions which would reject certain kind of practices, certain kind of explanation, and go for others, prefer others, I would suggest. Yes?
If a terrible event happens in a society, let's say airplanes came and crashed into buildings in a major city,
Yeah.
and the interpretation that was offered was selected amongst several. It was a criminal activity, it was a terrorist activity, it was an attack on the civilization. The one that is chosen is that it's a terrorist activity that reflects broader phenomenon that's out there. And if as a consequence of this action, this is the narrative that's adopted, and people therefore take on a series of beliefs and rituals which they repeat, taking off the shoes, putting out the airplane, putting out the phone, and the society thus comes to view itself relative to this set of beliefs, both within itself and also relative to something out there. I think you could sort of imagine all of the different ways these rituals would come to be reproduced and so forth. Could that phenomenon be studied according to the 3 days of lectures that you've offered us here today, or is there something that's substantively different about this event that makes it something other than comparable to religious, to the word religion that you use?
I think that it can and should be approached within the kind of general epidemiological framework I've suggested. That is, how beliefs about such an event are developed, stabilized, are challenged, are maintained, what kind of further practices they justify, how these practices themselves get modified, challenged, so on. All this has to be, I think the optimal explanation is indeed going through the micro-processes at the many junctures. I think that what you're doing in your question is describing it with the idiom of religion, speaking of a ritual of taking off one's shoes and so on and so on. I'm not denying that there may be instinct commonalities between the cultural and social and political impact of 9/11 in the United States and a number of religious phenomena. At the same time, I would want to step back and take the general epidemiological approach to study that rather than say, to insist from the start on these instinct analogies. So free lectures, no. Invite me for a semester, and then maybe we can start discussing it seriously. Yes. Okay. Yeah, sure. Look, well, first, thank you for agreeing with me that culture is made of these. It's not everybody does. It's not that trivial. I've given an example of one micro fragment of such a chain, and again done that in a very schematic manner. I don't think that we would get the kind of general knowledge we're after, because we're not particularly interested in Albazo and Mate. Frankly, I mean, I was somewhat interested in them, and none of you were before or are going to be after this lecture. I don't think it's by multiplying. I mean, getting all of them, or many of them, or a huge sample of them individually studied. What's important is to identify the factors that explain the causal effects that you get at each juncture along such chains, and understand how these causal factors themselves may have cumulative effect. So the situation is similar to that we have in epidemiology. When you do epidemiology of diseases, you're certainly not in a position to follow all the paths, all the chains of transmission, but you are in a position to identify, and it's hard, it's painstaking work, the kind of causal factors that make people more or less susceptibility to a certain medical condition, the environmental factors, the physiological factors that will do so. You can both study that, model it, and make a hypothesis as to the effects it would have at a population level, which can in turn be tested. And in many respects, we are in a better situation than medical epidemiologists, because medical epidemiologists are typically after forms of transmission and processes that are very hard to visualize. A lot of cultural transmission is done in the open. That's the only way you can transmit it. We're very, I mean, here we're in the business of culture, university, in the business of cultural transmission. It's documented all the time. It is, it's done openly, on record, and so on. Of course, there are a lot of aspects of cultural transmission which are implicit, which have to be discovered, and so on. But so I don't think that the challenge would be to get this huge database of millions of cases in order to get something interesting. But by the way, just as it might have seemed 20 years ago, unthinkable that we could have a DNA map and that we could add new species or new individual cheaply, and so on, and it has changed the science. It may be that for some form of cultural transmission, we will have, in fact, we begin to have massive data. And that's for cultural transmission that occurs on the internet. And then we do get that. There are people who are already working, having millions of chains of transmission that they can study with interesting results. But I don't think it will have it for traditional religion. What you're saying, what we want from that is to have some new insight about religion. Yes, I agree. We will learn something new from that, or is it just a new idiom to say things we already knew? In that case, it's useless. Well, it depends. It depends how you read the work of, we mentioned here Pascal Boyer, Scott Atran, more modestly, but an empirical study of the work of Brian Malley. So there's more and more work that's being done along those lines on empirical issues. If you think it's a source of insight, then yes, we've gained something. If you think it's not, maybe we can do better, or maybe it's the wrong way to go. So yes.
In thinking in terms of causes, there's causes of
mm.
but there's also sustainability of religion,
Yes, absolutely.
causes of sustainability.
Yeah.
I can't think of a single ancient religion, and perhaps not even the modern ones, whereby maybe the causes of sustainability of religion is associated with economic and political motivation. So could you speak briefly to causes as it relates to economics and politics of religion?
I'm sure you'd be better placed than I would be to give that lecture. But no, it's an absolutely relevant and important question. And again, I would just suggest make a methodological point rather than a substantial one. How does the economics affect the micro decision, the micro cognitive processes, the interactions, and how does that tilt either help sustain, maintain, stabilize religious practice, or bias them, cause them to evolve in specific direction. I mentioned en passant just a very small economic factor. A sacrifice costs. You need a sheep to sacrifice. Going to a seer you can make a little gift to the seer, but it's not even necessary. So that's an important economic factors which helps richer people go the sacrifice route, which contributes to their own authority and makes it more difficult for poor men and for women and so on to do so. But you can multiply the examples of how both the economic situation of the various people, agents involved in religion may affect their micro-choices, and how, conversely, these micro-choices may modify the economic situation, given the incentive to go. So it's what they're capable of doing, given their economic status, also what the economic expectation they can have from various religious behaviors. So yes, the things are integrated. I mean, it's not that you have religion there. I imagine all anthropologists in this room would agree that this kind of Royal Anthropological manual, field manual of the 40s doesn't work. I mean, you can't separate culture in this manner. But I fully agree with the spirit of your question. You had a question a while back.
I was interested in the relationship between oral tradition and writing.
Mm-hmm.
And in this respect, and it's something, whether it's a largely illiterate or minimally literate society, I don't know what they qualify their respect, but there certainly plenty in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
Or a hyper-literate society that we have. I mean, how does it cause us to think, to act differently, one means of transmission or the other? What is the normative effect of writing in the process?
Well, the example I gave of folk tale on an old tradition raises an interesting issue. What we find, and what Vladimir Prop had studied, and some folklorists have studied, the regularity you find in the contents of orally transmitted narrative across the world raises an interesting issue. Why do you get these regularities? And the line of answer I would suggest has to do with because they're kind of optimal for human memory. What you get is stories which are not good for human memory don't ever get a cultural level of distribution. They're forgotten or transformed towards more memorable form before they reach such a level of distribution. The moment you bring in writing, that is an external memory, then you can stabilize lots of other contents, including the contents of the folk narratives can now be enriched, exploited, and modified, and so on in ways where its dependence on human memory is not so present anymore. By the way, these are among the empirical topics that are clearly to which an epidemiological approach provides a fairly clear, relevant set of tools of studying it. Now, but you're interested more in the effects on normativity. Yeah. So again, think of legal systems in an oral versus we're in the law school here. So there's anthropology of law, and there are legal proceeding in a good sense in all traditions. But of course, both law and precedent take on a very different character once you have a written record. So there, just the fact that what's in this causal chain, what you get in the public events and artifacts, modify quite considerably, in a quite important manner, the kind of practices, content, beliefs, values, and so on that are likely to stabilize. So that is indeed a very important divide. So you've been waiting for a long time.
So it seems that putting together what was asked about economy, but also what the contribution could be, that a lot hinges on a real understanding of the transformation of these cultural, cognitive, causal chains. In terms of content, one way is to say, well, of course, in 1974, they outlawed the sacrifice, so we have a frequency change, nothing's here. But the question, of course, with anthropology is probably at least equally interesting is how do these first, whether these cultural practices, CCCs, differ qualitatively as representations in the mind from a non-cultural CCC, and how do the content changes? So what are the cognitive dynamics behind content change? Because if we would reach that level of understanding, like under the microscope through the CCCs, then we could start at emergent property, complex theory, complexity theory, understanding interactions like with the economy on the micro level of the cognitive changes involved. And then at emergent property, we can learn a lot more about systems, complex systems like religion, culture, or things like that. You talk a bit more about the representation. It's fairly abstract to what extent that the culture, cognitive,
What?
different qualities in species.
Okay.
On the representational level, like cognitive.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So think of, there are many animal species that have cognitive capacities. So they have cognitive causal chains. That is, they get inputs, they process the information, their behavior is guided by the information they have. Many species with cognitive capacities are not social, so that's all you get in terms of a cognitive causal chain among them. Now, take other species which are social but which are not cultural, and there are many of these. Then among them, what you'll get are social cognitive causal chains, that is short chains, which don't depend from a long historical past. They're just local interaction, and in this interaction, what you get are things like communication, imitation, and so on. So the cognitive content of one person play a causal role on the cognitive one individual play a causal role on the cognitive contents of another individual, and may have exactly the function to do so. So there you get your social CCCs, which are short and don't stabilize in the population practices, contents, or beliefs. They're just about local situations. So what you get when cultural phenomena emerge, or you could put it the other way, once you have in a species the capacity to have these extended chains where the same content is being sustained, maintained, and so on over time, this creates for this population a new kind of resource for the coordination of action, for competition, for also the individual process. So both for the individual cognitive processes, for the local interaction, now you have this set of resources that's provided to every individual, because every individual is situated through at the juncture of so many of these long cultural causal chains. But what they all have in common, and that's my point, which is not that obvious, again, is that what characterizes cognition is a process that has as its function to establish a content relationship. And that function can exist not only within an individual and its interface with its environment, but across individuals and across populations. That's not trivial, and it unifies the cognitive and the social sciences without reduction. Because indeed you need many other tools in the social science that you don't find in psychology. But it creates a continuity that's not present in the way these disciplines are being pursued now.
I would suggest that one causal chain that has been happening here is after 1.5 hours of talking, you'd just like to have a glass of wine right now. So I'd like to